Hello, everyone, and welcome to the HealthyXSundays podcast, where we bring you the most critical and actionable content in the nutrition and fitness space. Dave from Mind Muscle Pro and I, Kunal Jain, also known as Veg Diet Coach, are your hosts. Today, we have a distinguished guest who will shed light on the effects of glyphosate on our health and the environment. Please welcome Dr. Stephanie Seneff, a senior research scientist at MIT's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory with a background in biophysics and nutrition and a PhD in electrical engineering and computer science. She brings a unique perspective to the intersection of technology, biology, and human health. Dr. Seneff is also the author of Toxic Legacy: How the Weed Killer Glyphosate is Destroying Our Health and the Environment, a highly regarded book that was featured on Kirkus Review's Best of 2021 list and highlights the importance of understanding glyphosate's potential risks. Welcome, Dr. Seneff, to our podcast, and thanks for making time.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
So, can you share your background and what motivated you to delve into the realms of nutrition, health, and environmental chemicals like glyphosate?
Yes, well, my entire career has been at MIT, starting with the undergraduate work there, PhD, and then getting hired on staff and getting eventually to the highest level on the research staff, senior research scientist. And it's been a great career, but I spent most of it writing computer code. It was developing systems that would allow computers to interact with humans using natural language. So that's precursors to the AI, technology that today is sort of taking over the world. So we were early in that space of teaching computers how to provide information to humans using natural language. But along about 2007, I pivoted in a big way. I decided that I was worried about autism. I was seeing the rates of autism going up every year in the United States for quite a while, and it was being dismissed by the government as unimportant. They were able to say, well, we're just diagnosing it more, don't worry about it. But I didn't think so, because I remembered as a child, there was no autism whatsoever. So I knew something was going on. And I didn't think it could be genetic, even though most of the funds were in genetics, because genetics doesn't happen that fast. So there could be genetic predisposition. And the research was all about finding the genes. But I think, in fact, the big problem was, what is it in the environment that's poisoning our kids? And that was what I wanted to do. I wanted to find out. And I figured with my computer science background, I could look at statistical correlations and try to figure out, looking at different chemicals that they're exposed to, and try to figure out which one or which ones might be causing this epidemic. And I landed on glyphosate after 5 years. Very serendipitously, I happened to be at a conference where Professor Don Huber was talking about glyphosate. And I actually did not know the word when I walked into the room. After 2 hours of listening to him, I became convinced that I had found my answer. And I didn't look back. I just dove in at that point and read everything I could about glyphosate, started writing papers on it. And, almost 10 years later, I wrote the book, Toxic Legacy. So it's taken me a long time to get to the point where I had enough knowledge to be able to assemble the book. And the book really describes my, my story, and then, of course, my beliefs on exactly why I think glyphosate is much more toxic than we've been led to believe. And the industry is deceiving us and deceiving the government, which is a very serious problem. And it's pervasive in the food supply. So the kids are really very dangerously exposed to it every day.
Right. And it's also used a lot in India, glyphosate, so it's a huge problem. So, in simple terms, can you explain what glyphosate is and how it became such a widespread chemical in modern agriculture?
Sure, yeah. So glyphosate is the active ingredient in the herbicide Roundup. We know it as Roundup here. There are many other formulations, but Roundup is the really popular one here in the United States. People go down to the hardware store, pick it up, and garden store, get some glyphosate to kill the dandelions in their yard, and they think nothing of it. They don't use any kind of protection when they use it. The kids could be playing in the lawn. They don't realize that it's toxic, and that's very dangerous. And of course, then they use it all over the food supply. And I didn't realize the extensiveness of the use on the food supply until I started reading. And they introduced these GMO Roundup Ready crops in the late 1990s. And they were rolled out pretty swiftly. They started rising to being like 90% of the crop for corn and soy and canola and sugar beets and alfalfa. Those are kind of the core GMO crops that have been engineered to resist glyphosate, they can get sprayed all you want and it doesn't kill them. So it becomes a very efficient way to kill the weeds, to maintain control of the weeds without killing the plant. So they managed to do the studies in such a way as to deceive the government into thinking that it was safe. And once they got EPA approval, it's very hard to undo that. So at the moment, the EPA still thinks glyphosate is awesome. It's completely harmless to humans, but it kills all these weeds. And so it's so perfect, keeps our food cheap. They are very resistant to the idea that it might be toxic. And so it's been very difficult to change their minds, even though many, many papers are coming out, especially in the last few years, showing more and more kinds of trouble that glyphosate is causing in humans and in rats and in insects, all across the ecosystem. Glyphosate is really hurting life forms, and we really need to. The government needs to wake up. And I'm hopeful, of course, with the new administration in the United States. I don't know if you've been following that, but we have RFK Jr., who's in charge of HHS, Human Health Sciences, and he's going to make a difference. I think in changing the government's attitude towards the toxic chemical exposures and helping us to solve the autism crisis.
Absolutely.
Right. So, what impact does glyphosate have environmentally, and which species, obviously besides humans, does it have the most impact on?
I think it pretty much hurts every living form. It has a very, and my book writes about my theory, which I believe is true. And the more I look, the more convinced I am that I'm right. But my theory is not being accepted by the chemical industry. So I'm in a bit of a battle there, I could say. But I believe that glyphosate operates by a unique mechanism that, and I talk about it in my book, of being mistaken for the amino acid glycine during protein synthesis. It's a very specific mechanism of toxicity. And what happens is that it gets into certain proteins, and I have a specification of what I call a glyphosate susceptibility motif, certain pattern in the protein that is defined very well by the enzyme that glyphosate famously suppresses in the plants, which is this EPSP synthase. And so you can read my book to get the technical details, but basically glyphosate is when the protein is being made, according to the code, the DNA code, when it sees a code for glycine, it sees glyphosate and puts it in there instead of glycine, because glyphosate is a glycine molecule. It's a complete glycine molecule, except it has extra material stuck onto its nitrogen atom. So as long as there's room for that extra material, it can go in, it'll fit. And then when it gets into the protein, certain proteins, certain places, certain glycines have tremendous susceptibility to disruption of the protein if that glycine is swapped out for glyphosate. The protein can become dead in the water and it can become toxic. I mean, many different things can happen to proteins if that glycine gets substituted. And I can predict what would happen by studying the research literature on glycine mutations and things like that.
So besides autism, what are some of the other harmful effects on the human body?
Well, there's a huge list of diseases. Yeah, there's a huge list of diseases that are going up in prevalence in the United States, exactly in step with the rise in glyphosate usage, which has been going up exponentially since 2000. So we're getting more and more glyphosate exposure every year. And we can see that the diseases are going up as well. Our country is very sick. And I think that's part of why Trump got elected, because RFK Jr. has been saying our country is sick. We need to fix it. We need to figure it out. And glyphosate is going to be a major part, I think. If we can get rid of the glyphosate, we will start to see improvements. A big one is obesity. We have a huge problem with obesity in this country. And of course, diabetes and fatty liver disease that come from the obesity problem. All of that's tied together. And all of that, I think, is due to primarily the exposure to glyphosate. It disrupts the gut microbiome. And the gut microbiome plays a critical role in so many different health issues. And different people are affected different ways because their microbes get disrupted in different ways. So the microbiome is a very complex group of microbes that are working harmoniously together to do all the things that they do for the host, which is really legion. They do so many things for the host. And when certain microbes get killed off by glyphosate, those functions don't happen. And then you get sick because of deficiencies, because of toxicities of metabolites produced by the microbes. Lots of ways in which disruption of the gut microbiome causes a huge list of diseases, including diseases of the brain like Parkinson's disease. and autism, of course.
Right. So outside the US, like, have you come across any other, like, say, country like India where glyphosate usage is high? Like,
Well, I'm aware that India uses a lot of glyphosate. I don't think you're as bad as we are. I think Brazil and the United States are probably number one, number two. I'm not sure which one is number one, but we're both really bad, Brazil and the United States. Europe uses less, Mexico uses less, Canada uses a lot also, probably comparable to the United States. And I think Australia uses quite a bit. And India, I think, is not as bad. Africa is actually much, much better. And the Africans have their health to show for that. I think that the fact that the Africans were very resistant to COVID-19, a factor might be the lack of exposure to glyphosate, because glyphosate creates the diseases that are comorbidities with severe COVID. So when people who are overweight, people who have diabetes, they're more susceptible to severe disease when they catch COVID. And we have so many people with those problems that we end up with a much worse record. We have an incredibly high mortality rate from COVID-19 compared to other countries, which is correlated with our sad state of affairs in our health in general.
So, doctor, can you talk more about chronic diseases? What's
right. So,
Say that again.
sorry. So, can you talk about the impact on chronic diseases? You touched upon obesity, diabetes. How exactly does glyphosate impact chronic diseases in humans?
Yeah, so of course it's complicated, and it really has a lot to do with the specific enzymes that glyphosate disrupts. And of course, beginning with the gut microbiome, and that's a critical place to start, because glyphosate preferentially kills beneficial bacteria like bifidobacteria and lactobacillus that are crucial in the infant gut. So even the infant getting exposed to glyphosate from the formula, soy-based formula, or even from the breast milk, because glyphosate's been found in breast milk, the gut microbiome gets disrupted. And then you get an overgrowth of toxic species that produce toxic metabolites. Products that the pathogens are producing can actually travel to the brain and cause damage to the brain. There's a critical role for the short chain fatty acids that the microbes normally would produce. And those are, for example, butyrate. There's a lot of talk about butyrate lately in America. Many people are aware of the importance of the short chain fatty acid butyrate for the gut, for the colonocytes in the colon. So to keep the colon healthy, you need a lot of butyrate. That's their colonocytes' favorite food. And the butyrate is produced by the gut microbes through fermentation from the foods that you eat. They convert it into butyrate. And when the colonocytes don't have enough butyrate, they get sick. And that gives you things like inflammatory bowel disease. It can give you ultimately colon cancer. And these are diseases that are going up dramatically, exactly in step with glyphosate. So part of it is just messing up the microbes. They also provide critical, B vitamins for the host, and the actual shikimate pathway that's disrupted in the gut microbes is the source of 3 essential amino acids, the aromatic amino acids. They're part of the coding of all the proteins. So those can become deficient. And furthermore, those amino acids are precursors to many biologically active molecules, including neurotransmitters, the skin tanning agent, melanin, melatonin, which is for sleep. We have an epidemic in sleep disorder, not enough melatonin, serotonin, dopamine, all these neurotransmitters that are essential for the mood, and for your, and things like anxiety, all of these conditions that we have, depression, anxiety, which are all going up dramatically in our society, I think can be explained by the insufficient production of these neurotransmitters and hormones that come out of that shikimate pathway, which glyphosate disrupts. And over half of our microbes in our gut are susceptible to glyphosate through that shikimate pathway disruption.
all right. So, how prevalent is glyphosate in our food ecosystem, and what are the common foods we are looking at, rather, which contains glyphosate?
That's a good question. I can only speak for the United States because I'm not sure. I know you guys have a lot of cotton, I think, in India, and cotton is actually a source of cottonseed oil. It's not considered a food crop, but the cottonseed oil probably has a lot of glyphosate. The cotton is sprayed routinely with glyphosate, and that I think is a problem. It's a GMO Roundup Ready crop. And but it's not just the GMO crops. A lot of people think if I see a non-GMO label, it's safe, I can eat it, I won't have glyphosate. And that's not true at all. Actually, some of the highest levels are found in crops that are non-GMO. And this includes, for example, wheat and barley and rye and oats. So oatmeal and oat cereals for the children, oat milk, they're all going to have glyphosate. And then also garbanzo beans, chickpeas. So the Indians eat a lot of beans. Actually, I heard something about Canada selling beans to India, and India actually becoming aware that the Canadian beans would be contaminated with glyphosate. And I think they issued, maybe some counties in India or something issued a ban on Canadian imports of, do you know anything about that? I don't maybe have it exactly right, but there was something a few years back that I heard about India restricting imports of Canadian legumes, so lentils and chickpeas and garbanzo beans, which are, I think, pretty common in Indian food. You really need to eat those as certified organic because they have some of the highest levels. Canada did a big test of over 8,000 different food samples and then they published a book. My friend Tony Mitra, who pressured them to do this test, published a book called Poison Foods of North America, where he detailed the results of the Canadian study. And he showed that these garbanzo beans and chickpeas had sky-high levels of glyphosate in them because they're sprayed right before harvest as a desiccant. So they're not GMO. The glyphosate actually kills the crop, which is the intent, because it's ready to be harvested. And they basically synchronize so everything goes to seed at the same time. They increase the yield. They also can get a head start on the weeds for next year's crop. And they can often beat the frost, because in Canada it's cold. You could have a cold air come in and kill the crop. So they want to harvest it before it gets cold.
Right. From what I know, in India, it's commonly used with wheat, maize, corn. Basically, that sort of GMO crops is where you use glyphosate the most.
Right.
And interestingly, you mentioned oatmeal. I think oats is something we in India see it like everywhere practically. We see it as something that is super healthy, right? And if there is this threat of glyphosate, then we are practically doing slow suicide.
Right. I'm worried in here because many kids are allergic to, they have casein intolerance. They can't eat milk products. They can't drink milk. And then we have a big supply of oat milk lately that I've been seeing oat milk as a substitute for milk because of sensitivities to milk, which I think is due to glyphosate. So if the glyphosate causes you to be sensitive to milk, and then you go on a dairy-free diet and you switch to oat milk, which has even more glyphosate in it than the original milk, which just makes your situation worse. So, and the same thing with the garbanzo beans and the chickpeas. If you're trying to avoid wheat, gluten intolerance is a huge problem in our country today. Many people are avoiding wheat-based products. That, again, I think is directly caused by the glyphosate in the wheat. And so then they switch to beans, and the beans are loaded with glyphosate. So it's kind of like you out of the frying pan into the fire, because you end up with even more glyphosate exposure once you get rid of those foods that you can't eat because glyphosate has made it intolerable for you to digest them.
Interestingly, we have come across situations where some of our clients have wheat products from India. They feel terrible. They go to Europe. They don't feel so much. They go to US. They feel terrible again. So
yes, there you go.
What we perceive as, say, gluten intolerance and all that is possibly a glyphosate issue.
I think I'm very confident that it is. It makes a lot of sense to me. The glyphosate is the primary cause, because before glyphosate, we didn't have gluten intolerance. It was very rare. And in fact, I've written a paper on that where I showed that the use of glyphosate on wheat, it went up over time and matched well with the increase in celiac disease.
So is there a way, like Americans, when they do grocery shopping, they can avoid glyphosate? Is there any food labeling sort of thing.
Yeah, we don't label GMOs. There's been a big fight to try to get the government to agree to label GMOs, but crops that are not GMO labeled themselves as non-GMO because they know that's a healthy thing to say. But then we have certified organic, and that is super, super important. And so we've got increasing, I've been watching the grocery stores over the past decade, and I can see increasing availability of certified organic foods, even in the common grocery stores. You know, you have the boutique markets that are expensive, and they often have quite a bit of organic selectivity. Costco has been fantastic. Costco is a big store that you have a card, you know, you become a member, and they sell things in large quantities, but they have a lot of selection opportunity for buying certified organic foods at Costco, and of course Whole Foods. So we have some grocery stores that have that focus on increasing the amount of certified organic choices, but even the main everyday grocery stores are showing more and more, putting out more and more organic foods on their shelves. And you often see also that the organics are flying off the shelf. So I'm actually pleased when I go to the grocery store, even though I mean, I have a problem because all the organics are gone, but you have all the signs where there's the organic vegetables and fruits and there's none there because everyone has been buying those instead of the non-organic. So I feel there's been a great deal of improvement in the awareness of the population here of the need to convert to certified organic in order to stay healthy, particularly, of course, in the United States, where the non-organic food is so toxic.
Right. So are there any types of foods which individuals can prioritize to defend against glyphosate's harmful effects?
Possibly. I've spoken and claimed that it's possible that eating fermented foods may be a way to break down glyphosate, because there are only a few microbes that know how to break down glyphosate. That's part of its problem. It's very resistant to breakdown by enzymes, enzymatic breakdown, because it has what's called a CP bond, a carbon phosphorus bond. That's a tricky thing to break, and most species don't know how to break that bond. But there are a few microbes, and one of them is some of the Acetobacter. Some of the members of the Acetobacter family can break glyphosate down enzymatically. And Acetobacter are very common in fermented foods. So I'm hoping that if you eat fermented foods with live culture, you might be eating microbes that can metabolize the glyphosate, which I think would be really awesome if it's true. People also suggest, people who are nutritionists and alternative medicine specialists, they've been suggesting taking bentonite clay or fulvic acid and humic acid, which is organic matter from the soil. These are binders, and so they're known to be able to bind to toxic molecules and then take them out through the feces. So that may be also a productive way to help to reduce the load of glyphosate in your gut. But getting it out of your body is really, really hard, because I think it gets incorporated into proteins throughout your body. Collagen in particular, collagen has a lot of glycine and has a long sequence of GXY, 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 where every third amino acid is a glycine. Tremendous opportunity for glyphosate to substitute. And there are known diseases that are caused by mutations in those glycines. And so we have a lot of issues right now in this country with various problems with the joints and the bones. A lot of people are suffering from, back pain and knee replacement surgery, hip replacement surgery. People have a lot of issues with their bones, especially, of course, as they get older. But it's much worse today than it used to be. It feels like to me. And in fact, you can see that the number of operations, knee operations that are happening are going up over time. And I think it could be because glyphosate is contaminating the collagen and then disrupting its ability to form its shape. It has this important, sort of triple helix structure that it creates that gives it its properties in terms of its tensile strength and its flexibility, its ability to hold water. All of those things can get messed up if it gets glyphosate bullets throughout the molecule. And in fact, my friend Anthony Samsel got a sample of the horse's hoof, of a hoof that died from founder. Founder is a disease of the hoofs that the horses are suffering from. And the hoofs have lots and lots of collagen. And Anthony tested the hoof for glyphosate and found high levels of glyphosate in the hoof. So this is evidence that it is, in fact, accumulating in the tissues. It's very important. And of course, also there was a study on pigs, deformed piglets. There's a paper published on deformed piglets coming out of Europe, I think Denmark. And they tested these piglets organs for glyphosate, and they found glyphosate contamination in the organs. This just tells you that glyphosate is, in fact, getting into the tissues and staying there.
Right. And could you elaborate on why consuming a diverse array of plants is crucial for gut health and overall wellness?
Well, yes, the plants are really great. And there are all these different fancy phenolic compounds that the plants produce that are antioxidants, And so I am actually a great believer in eating a lot of herbs and spices. And I love this about India. I actually love Indian food. You guys are lucky because you have a lot of herbs and spices that go into your foods. And I think that's very, very important to help you, as an antioxidant, it protects you from oxidative damage. And oxidative damage is something that glyphosate causes. It disrupts the mitochondria, and the mitochondria start spewing out this reactive oxygen, which damages the tissues. And so by virtue of having these really special molecules, many of them are ring molecules that are produced by, and those molecules, by the way, often come out of that shikimate pathway. So one of the issues with glyphosate exposure to the plant is that it will disrupt its ability to produce these wonderful molecules that are so beneficial for our health.
Right.
Right. So, how important are sulfur-containing foods? I think that is something you mentioned.
I have talked a lot about sulfur. I actually identified sulfate deficiency, I should say, as a key factor in autism before I even knew about glyphosate. So I got onto the sulfur idea early on in my research on autism, and I'm still convinced that that autism can be characterized by a dysbiosis in a way, an inability to handle sulfur properly. And sulfur is an incredibly important nutrient. And we are also probably deficient in sulfur because glyphosate disrupts the ability of the plants to take up sulfur. So the plants that we eat become sulfur deficient when they're exposed to glyphosate. But worse than that, glyphosate messes up enzymes that are involved in making sulfate, and in making the activated form of sulfate, and in transferring sulfate from one molecule to another. All of those enzymes have what I call glyphosate susceptibility motif. They're very sensitive to glyphosate substitution for glycine. I talk about it in my book. And so I believe that glyphosate is disrupting the body's ability to make sulfated molecules. And those sulfated molecules are incredibly important, particularly in the brain, where there's a molecule called heparan sulfate that goes into the brain ventricles. And the heparan sulfate is essential for the development of the brain in utero. So for the fetus to have a healthy brain as it develops, it needs to have heparan sulfate, adequate amounts of heparan sulfate in the brain ventricles. And studies on both mice and humans have shown that the autistic people and the autistic mice have low levels of heparan sulfate in their brain. So that is a direct feature of autism that I think is a consequence of glyphosate disrupting the ability to make the heparan sulfate.
All right. So, we mentioned a lot about glyphosate in the food. So, what about water contamination? Is that a threat?
It is both water and air. I mean, if you live near the fields where the glyphosate's being sprayed, you're going to breathe it. And I think if you breathe glyphosate, you're going to get a lung condition that is that's pretty nasty. There's actually, I mean, I've talked about the idea that I have of it disrupting lung surfactants, again, because of the glycine problem. The glycine substitution problem can cause, those surfactants have a collagen-like stalk, and that collagen-like stalk is going to get messed up by glyphosate, and the lung surfactants will then be deficient. They won't be able to go out and do their job, which is in part to trap the microbes. So you're going to have a greater sensitivity to infection with viruses, but you're also going to have sick lungs. And I think that that's a possibility. I'm even suspecting that vaping is causing a strange lung disease that looks a bit like COVID-19. It's a non-infectious lung disease from vaping cigarettes. You know, these e-cigarettes, as they're called. And I suspect that glyphosate is a contaminant in those e-cigarettes because glycerol is the base of the cigarette, and glycerol is a byproduct of the biofuel industry, which is using the plants that are glyphosate resistant. The GMO crops are being turned into biofuel, and then the glycerol is a byproduct, which is then being used to make the e-cigarettes, and it's probably contaminated with glyphosate. I haven't tested it, but I'm suspecting.
All right. So one of the other, just taking a detour, one of the other things you speak a lot about is atrazine.
Atrazine,
So,
well, yes, I certainly have. Yeah. Well,
yeah.
atrazine has
So
been shown.
is that akin to, is
Atrazine
it
is
similar
also
to
an herbicide.
glyphosate, or is there like,
Yeah, it's an herbicide, just like glyphosate. It has a different mechanism of toxicity, and I have not studied it anywhere near as much as I've studied glyphosate. But I do know that there's a researcher called Tyrone Hayes, Hayes. I've heard him give a couple of talks, and he's been very big on the idea that atrazine causes tadpoles to turn into, it causes XY tadpoles, male tadpoles, to turn into female frogs. They've become completely female with the ability to lay viable eggs when they're exposed to atrazine. So he's been really pushing this idea that atrazine is a disruptor, a hormone disruptor, endocrine disruptor, that's causing these frogs to be very confused about their sexuality.
right? Kunal, you can.
Right. So, doctor, what strategies do you propose for supporting a healthy microbiome in the face of glyphosate exposure?
Well, we've gotten into some of it already, which is, I think you should eat a lot of fermented foods, eat sulfur-rich foods, and that includes both vegetarian, vegetable-based and animal-based. There's actually some really good, cysteine is an amino acid that's more common in animal-based foods. Now, I guess in India, you have a lot of people who are vegetarian. You may be vegetarian as well, but the Indians do perfectly well with their vegetarian diet. I don't want to say it's bad, of course, but I do feel that animal-based foods have a lot of healthy fats and healthy sources of cysteine, which is a sulfur-containing molecule that's a precursor to glutathione, and glutathione is a really important antioxidant. It can keep your liver healthy, for example, and so you need to have the cysteine, an adequate cysteine, to be able to make glutathione. So many people in America take cysteine or N-acetylcysteine as a supplement in order to support glutathione. I'm not a fan of supplements in general. I much prefer to eat natural foods and eat a very rich diet that has a lot of variety. And as you said, as I mentioned, herbs and spices. I think herbs and spices are really great, and especially if you can get them fresh herbs and spices. And we use cilantro and dill and basil, a lot of different herbs in our cooking in my household for that reason. And also, of course, spices. And so the curry, of course, the Indian curry is fantastic. And that's been shown actually to protect from Alzheimer's disease. So those are all really encouraged. Eat a lot of spicy food and to eat a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables and vegetables that contain sulfur, like the cruciferous vegetables. So just to eat a lot of fruits and vegetables and of course, just to then eat less of the sort of what I call empty carbs, like potato and rice. Those are less nutritious. They don't have as much of a rich nutritional basis as these other foods do. So it's good to eat a lot of, for me, it's seafood, eggs. Eggs are really good, healthy food, and then vegetables and fruits and meats, kind of emphasizing those foods. And of course, don't eat candy, don't eat soy protein bars, none of that, of those heavily processed foods. Avoid those, even if they're organic, I would say.
Right. And doctor, is there a way we can process the vegetables, like washing them before cooking? Does that take care of a bit of
It
glyphosate?
won't take the glyphosate out. The glyphosate is embedded in the tissues of the plant, so you can't get it out by washing. You might be able to get some of the insecticides off by washing, I would think. So washing is probably a good idea, but it won't get rid of the glyphosate.
Right. And are there any lifestyle changes apart from incorporating more herbs, etc.? Are there any other lifestyle changes which can help in
Well,
removing?
I recommend sunlight. I'm a really big fan of sunlight. So get out in the sun. You have a lot of sun in India, right? Get out in the sun. Enjoy the sunlight. Don't use sunscreen. Don't use sunglasses. So I'm a big fan of the sun. I believe it provides a great deal more benefit than just the vitamin D is already very important, and they've shown that people who get severe COVID often have vitamin D deficiency. We have an epidemic in vitamin D deficiency in this country, and it might be in part due to glyphosate, I believe, because in part because of the sulfation problem, because when the skin makes vitamin D in response to sunlight, it actually adds sulfate to the vitamin D and ships it out as a sulfated product. And the sulfate is taken off when it gets to its destination, and it's delivered as vitamin D. But both the vitamin D and the sulfate get delivered to the destination. But when you have a disruption of the sulfate system, it's not as easy for the skin to deliver, to distribute the vitamin D over the blood.
Right. On an individual level, what can we do to reduce glyphosate? Because it's practically everywhere.
Right. Well, you could have your drinking water tested and see if it tests positive. And if it does test positive, you can put in a reverse osmosis filter to try to take the glyphosate out. So that would be one thing you could do with respect to your water. As I said, eating certified organic food is really important. Try to see that. Do you guys have certified organic labels on the food in India? Do you have choices
Yes.
like that? Yes. So, whenever you see the certified organic label, that's going to be, they can cheat. So it's not always, and of course they can also end up with glyphosate, even though they're not using it because of it being in the air and the water. I actually got a sample of rain water from my office in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and sent it to Anthony Samsel, who found glyphosate contamination in the rain. So the rain comes down on the crop, it gives the crop glyphosate. That's in the manure also. There was a very interesting paper by Professor Don Huber, who's the one who introduced me to glyphosate. He published a recent paper with some co-authors about sauerkraut. It was a very sad story because the sauerkraut was organic sauerkraut, but they used chicken manure and turkey manure as a fertilizer on the sauerkraut, on the crop. And the manure had a lot of glyphosate because the animals were eating a lot of glyphosate contaminated foods. And then the glyphosate got into the crop and messed up the structure. And this is probably because it got into the fibers that make up the cabbage. And so the cabbage, when they tried to make the sauerkraut, it was just a mess. It was all soggy and it was inedible, and they had to throw it away. A lot of cabbage, the whole crop was ruined, and they couldn't sell the cabbage. So they lost a lot of money on that. And they did enough research to figure it out that it was, in fact, this problem with the manure. And they actually found a way to help to remediate the soil, which is very interesting because they could actually use the sauerkraut juice that's produced by the microbial process and put it back on the soil. And the microbes in the sauerkraut juice could metabolize. This is what I'm saying about the possibility of Acetobacter removing glyphosate. The microbes in the juice could actually remove the glyphosate from the soil, which was an interesting twist to the story. So it's a very interesting article that recently came out.
Right. So we have some very interesting audience questions.
Okay.
Yeah. So one of the questions,
I couldn't understand that. It was garbled from the internet.
because it has the same structure as glycine, can we consume L-glycine to counter off? We just repeat.
Oh,
So because it
yes.
has the same structure as glycine, can we
Yes.
consume L-glycine as a counter off to glyphosate being consumed in the instance we are eating out or traveling? So his question
Right.
is, can we use L-glycine to
Right.
counter off
Yes,
glyphosate?
I got it. I think so. I actually have friends who are practitioners who have found that glycine as a supplement has been beneficial for people, for example, with autism or other kinds of neurological diseases. Eating taking L-glycine orally has helped them. And so these people are believers that it's a good idea to make sure you have plenty of glycine to counteract the glyphosate, because then it will be less likely for the glyphosate to get into the proteins if there's more competition from glycine. So I think it probably is a good idea to take glycine as a supplement to help to offset the glyphosate, decrease the risk of glyphosate getting into the proteins. Yes.
Right. Another question is on public policy. At a policy level, how are governments around the world overlooking these dangerous side effects of including antibiotic resistance? So, what is the data to support, and what policy changes can be done?
There have been some countries that have banned glyphosate, particularly, I think it was Nicaragua in Central America. They had a huge problem with their the people who harvested the sugarcane crop were getting a really nasty kidney disease at a young age that was killing them. and they suspected that it might be caused by glyphosate. And so they actually banned the use of glyphosate in Nicaragua. And a similar thing happened in Sri Lanka. And Sri Lanka also banned glyphosate because of their, it wasn't sugarcane, but I think it was rice farmers that were getting sick from, and glyphosate was being used, and glyphosate was contaminating their water supply, and they were dying of kidney failure. So it's a very, glyphosate can be really hard on the kidneys. If you know, maybe especially if you're exposed to the air, I'm not sure. But anyway, these farmers in particular that were harvesting the glyphosate right after it had been sprayed with the glyphosate, they're harvesting the crop right after it had been sprayed with the glyphosate. This is the case with the Nicaraguan sugarcane farmers, because sugarcane is one of the crops that's sprayed as a ripener right before harvest. And so, so Nicaragua banned glyphosate, and Sri Lanka banned glyphosate, and Mexico has been working really hard to ban glyphosate. The United States has been fighting back, and Monsanto's been suing them. It's been really quite a mess. I've been following this for many years now. And I think it's going to eventually happen, but it keeps getting postponed because, you know, there's lawsuits and all this stuff. They want to ban the import of GMO corn from the United States. And the United States actually provides Mexico with quite a bit of corn, and corn is a staple in Mexico. And so the United States is upset because they're afraid they're going to lose that, the profits from those sales. And so we've been trying to keep them from banning glyphosate, which is really awful. And also there's certain cities or in the United States, many in California, some on the East Coast, that have, the city itself has banned glyphosate usage in public places. So there's some movements that way. Meanwhile, the industry is getting clever, and they're trying to fight back again with legally by trying to get the states to introduce laws that would actually give the company a get out of jail free card. So if a person says your glyphosate caused my non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, because we have all these lawsuits for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma being attributed to glyphosate exposure, and they're trying to pass laws state by state. There's several states where the companies are trying to introduce these laws, bills, you know, that could become law, to say that glyphosate, that the company cannot be sued because of injury from glyphosate, because glyphosate is such an essential component of agriculture that we can't afford not to have it. So it's really twisted. It's like, because glyphosate is so important to our crops and to our ability to feed our country, we can't allow people to sue the company if they get injured by glyphosate. So that is really a terrible, terrible thing if it passes. My friends have been trying, I have a lot of politically active friends who have been trying to push back on this, to pressure the state senators not to pass these bills.
Right, doctor. And can you talk about the link with mental health? You talked about Parkinson's disease. Is there any other issue you see with mental
Oh,
health?
absolutely. I mean, you look at Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease, and even ALS, which is Lou Gehrig's disease. These are all awful neurodegenerative diseases that are all going up dramatically in our country, exactly in step with the rise in glyphosate usage. I think glyphosate is causal. I think it's, and in fact, I think there are a lot of parallels between Alzheimer's disease in the elderly and autism in the child. There's a lot of things that are going on in the brain that are similar to injure the neurons, but it has a different manifestation at the different ages. You know, and so Alzheimer's is really the neurons are being destroyed by oxidative damage that's being caused by glyphosate. And partly that's because glyphosate increases the uptake of glutamate. Glutamate is a neurotransmitter, but if the neuron gets too much glutamate, it can become neurotoxic and kill the neuron. And so glyphosate has been shown in experiments with mice, for example, that the glyphosate gets into the neurons, increases the neuron's uptake of glutamate, which then kills the neuron. It's a mechanism that they see. And that could be, again, related to glyphosate substituting for glycine, because there's a protein in the nurse cells that take care of the astrocytes, which are the cells that take care of the neurons. Those cells are responsible for taking the glutamate up and turning it into glutamine and safely storing it after the neuron releases it into the synapse. So the glutamate, you need to get it out before it can cause to be too toxic. And the enzymes that do that are suppressed by glyphosate, and it could be through this glycine substitution mechanism.
In India, there is a loophole that the main crop may not be sprayed by glyphosate, but the adjacent weeds are sprayed by glyphosate.
Oh, yeah,
So,
that's too bad.
so is there a similar kind of loophole in organic
Oh,
label?
absolutely. We have a lot of crops where the glyphosate is used on the weeds adjacent to the, so for example, strawberries end up with glyphosate because it's used on the weeds around the strawberries. Um, Definitely, we have that same problem.
Right.
And you know, the olives in Greece have a nasty disease that they're coping with right now. And I suspect that that also may have been caused. It's an infectious disease. I think it's a fungus disease. I see many examples of fungus disease that I believe is caused by glyphosate. Professor Don Huber thinks so too. There's a problem in Florida with the citrus fruits, the oranges. They have a citrus greening problem that is a fungus infection. And Professor Don Huber has helped the farmers there to research this problem, and he's taught them that if they switch over to an organic crop, that problem goes away. They showed that that was the case. Once they got rid of the glyphosate, the citrus greening problem went away. So it's causing a lot of, and of course the bees, we have a lot of insects that are just being clobbered by the glyphosate. I think the bee colony collapse syndrome, glyphosate's a major player there, along with the insecticides. But I bet you glyphosate is at least as much of a problem as the insecticides for bee colony collapse, and also for the monarch butterfly. The monarch butterfly is disappearing in our country. We used to have so many of them migrating down to Mexico, actually. And on the way to Mexico, they starve because they get a metabolic disorder by eating the milkweed that's contaminated with glyphosate. Milkweed is a weed that grows in the corn crops. They use the glyphosate to kill the milkweed. The bees eat the milkweed. They get heavily contaminated with glyphosate and they die. Not the bees, the monarch butterflies. Monarch butterflies.
Right, doctor. And because of avoiding a lot of labor costs, farmers keep on using glyphosate. So is there a safe and a more economically viable alternative to glyphosate?
Well, that's an excellent question. And I'm actually having some hope for robotics, because there are some people who are designing some robotic tractors, some agile tractors that actually run on solar energy and that can be programmed to sort of go between the crops. And then they can actually use vision to recognize a weed. And then they can use something like a laser or like boiling water to kill the weed. So to specifically go into the crops and recognize the weeds, kill the weeds, and protect the crops. If we can do something with robotics to replace human labor, that would be a big win, because of course the problem is the human labor is so expensive. And with the glyphosate, you avoid a huge cost of getting people out there to pull the weeds by hand. You don't want to be doing it that way. There are also some organic, non-toxic herbicides that you can use. And there's a simple formulation that I believe involves soap, salt, and vinegar. Vinegar, salt, soap. Yeah, I think so. Formulation that's safe, and that people can just make that actually and use it to kill the weeds in their yard.
Right. A little different question. This is about MSG, which is used in cooking. So any thoughts on if kids are consuming MSG, what can be ways to counter that?
Right. I think MSG may be a factor in autism. And in fact, I remember reading an article by a woman who was a scientist and who had an autistic daughter. And she was trying everything she could think of to try to heal her daughter of autism. And she did some things and she got better, but then she was still, autistic. And then she finally figured out glutamate. She realized that it was, glutamate contamination, glutamate presence in the foods that the child was eating, that she thought might be a contributing factor, especially, of course, because glyphosate increases the risk of glutamate toxicity because of it encouraging glutamate to get into the cells. But once she was able to, and she said it was hard to do, because when you look at all the ingredients, there's a lot of different disguises that it's actually MSG, but they call it like protein, I forget, solids or something. There's a lot of different words for what turns out to be glutamate. And she learned how to watch out for that in the products that she bought. So she was very careful to eliminate free glutamate in her daughter's food supply. And that was when her daughter got her autism reversed. So that is a remarkable story. And I certainly took that to heart. So I do think, and again, that's the processed foods, because glutamate in a protein is okay, but when the glutamate is free, that's what makes it different.
Right. And is there a way to completely eradicate glyphosate from our body?
Not really. No, I think you're stuck with it. I think it's extremely hard to get rid of it because of this problem of it getting into the proteins. I think it's all over our body. And in fact, when a protein that has glyphosate in it gets broken down, the glyphosate is freed up and now it goes into another protein. So it just wanders around your body, getting into different proteins and causing trouble. I think it's very, very hard to get rid of it. I hope I'm wrong, but I don't see how to do that.
And the same question about, is it possible to get it off from our environment?
Well, that's going to be a really big challenge. I'm hopeful. I want to reach a point where so many people are aware of the problems with glyphosate that they refuse to buy the food unless it's certified organic. And that will put a lot of pressure on the farmers to switch to organic agriculture. And I'm hoping that eventually we'll get to the point where we'll see it disappear. It actually has long-term effects. There's studies that show that there was an amazing study on, I believe it was mice, where the pregnant mouse was exposed to low-dose glyphosate while she was pregnant. The pups seemed to be fine. The mouse seemed to be fine. They looked at later generations, the children, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren, and things got worse and worse with each generation, with various kinds of problems like reproductive issues and obesity and diabetes. These kinds of problems were showing up in the later generations as a consequence of the exposure to the great-grandmother during pregnancy. It's really quite remarkable. It actually alters the germline with epigenetic effects that survive through multiple generations.
Right. Doctor, does fasting have any effect in decreasing glyphosate toxicity in the body?
Fasting might be a mechanism that could help, because I would imagine that it would allow you to break down proteins that contain glyphosate. Because when you're fasting, you're sort of using your own body as fuel, right? So you're breaking down your own proteins. You would free up the glyphosate, and if you could get it into the circulation, get it to the kidneys and get rid of it, you could actually be removing some of the glycine, some of the glyphosate that's combined, that's inside the proteins. You could get rid of some of that by breaking it down because you're using your own proteins as a source of energy. That's possible, but I don't know if it's true or not, but it's just logically it could be.
So do you see any hope for the future when big corporate companies are fighting for profits, and how do you see?
It's pretty depressing. I certainly have had my dark moments when I kind of think, maybe if we just got rid of the humans, the earth would be beautiful again. It's kind of like, if we're going to make ourselves go extinct, it might be good riddance. I don't really want to feel that dark, but I'm hoping that more and more people will wake up and we'll change our policies. The governments will actually do something right for a change, and we'll clean up our food supply, and then we'll see a great improvement in our health, and everybody will be feeling much, much better. I'm hopeful, especially, as I said, with the new administration, with RFK Jr., who is really, he has been fighting these companies all his life, as a lawyer, and making inroads into getting people aware of the problems that we face with our failing health in the United States as a consequence of our toxic food. So I think he's positioned now to do something important, and I really hope he does.
And what's your take on deuterium, since you talk about?
Give me just a few minutes to talk about. How long do we go? When do we stop?
We are good as long as you.
Okay, I was thinking we might have an hour and it's almost over, but yeah, deuterium. Well, I'm really, really interested in deuterium. That's been my latest passion. I'm really, really fascinated by it, and I do believe that glyphosate's toxicity may really. Deuterium is a critical factor in how glyphosate messes things up in the body, and I was not aware of deuterium as a toxic chemical, a toxic molecule at all, toxic atom actually. Deuterium is an atom. It's just a hydrogen atom with an extra neutron, so it's twice as heavy as hydrogen, and it's a rare isotope of hydrogen, but it's actually very common compared to, for example, calcium. It's like 6 times as much deuterium in the blood as there is calcium. So although it's rare relative to hydrogen, it's not rare. And it actually has a major effect on the mitochondria. It breaks the mitochondrial ATPase pumps. And that becomes a really big problem because then the mitochondria can't make as much ATP. And they also spew out reactive oxygen, which damages the cell. And glyphosate has been shown in multiple studies to cause the mitochondria to get sick and to cause them to release this reactive oxygen. And I'm suspecting that the mechanism may be through its disruption of the body's ability to keep deuterium out of the mitochondria. And that involves a lot of enzymes that glyphosate suppresses. So there's a whole bunch of dehydrogenases in particular, really a long list of dehydrogenases. Many of them are actually in the mitochondria, but also the microbes have a lot of dehydrogenases that are probably all suppressed by glyphosate. That's what I believe, because the dehydrogenases have this very, very perfect glyphosate susceptibility motif. So I believe that the dehydrogenases are sensitive to glyphosate. They don't work as well. And the consequences are legion because it ends up not the cell, the organism is not able to keep the deuterium out of mitochondria and they get sick. So that's kind of the short story there, but it's a very interesting topic that's kind of really caught my attention lately. And I've been spending a lot of time studying metabolism with the angle of trying to figure out the deuterium. So it's been a fun project for me recently.
Very interesting. And do you think infrared sauna can help detoxify glyphosate?
Maybe. I think infrared sauna is a healthy thing to do. I think it's definitely beneficial to your health. Exactly how it might, I don't know how it might actually allow glyphosate to be broken down. But I guess if you're sweating, you might release glyphosate through the skin. So you might be able to shed it that way.
Right. So there's an audience question. There is an activist in India called Vandana Shiva who is against glyphosate and GMO seeds. So have you worked with anyone in India on this topic?
Yes. Shoot, I lost her name. No. Vandana Shiva. Vandana Shiva.
Yes.
I know her and I really like her. And she's been also fighting the GMOs for a long time.
Right. So have you been to India, doctor?
I have, yes. I only went once. It was really very, very interesting. It was back when I was doing my language work, and I was so impressed with all the languages. We were thinking about, it was part of this million book project out of Carnegie Mellon University. And we went to several different cities in India with the idea, it was digitizing books, the idea of digitizing books, ancient books, that are important to preserve. But we were impressed with all the different languages, and to think about how one could communicate among all these people who speak all these languages was really quite interesting.
Right. I think we are on the hour, and so I'll ask the audience, are there any other questions you have for doctor? Or any closing thoughts from your side, doctor?
Well, thank you for doing this. I enjoyed talking with you, and I hope that your audience will take heed, because I really think it's an important thing for people to be aware of. And then, of course, it's not just glyphosate. There are many other contaminants in the food that make it unhealthy. And so the idea of eating certified organic, there are a lot of things you can't do if you're going to call your crop certified organic. So it's worth the extra money, I believe, to buy certified organic when you shop, or to get to know your farmer and make sure he's not using chemicals. Buy directly from the farm. That's also very nice.
Right. So with that, we come to the end of our podcast, and we want to really thank you so much for sharing such valuable insights. And I'm sure the audience is going to benefit so much from your thoughts. So thank you, doctor. I think Dave has an internet connection issue. So on his behalf, I want to thank you. And it was lovely talking to you. Thank you for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It was my pleasure.
Thank you. Take care.
You too.